All those stories our parents and grandparents would tell us about, like, hidden speakeasies and bathtub gin and gangsters, running wild during Prohibition.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Well, today we're diving into that fascinating era.
It's really incredible how this period in American history, which was meant to actually reduce alcohol consumption,
Yeah,
really just gave rise to this whole underground culture. It
yeah.
shaped everything from fashion and music to, organized crime and even our political landscape.
It's amazing, isn't it?
Oh, it really is.
I actually came across a statistic while I was researching for this deep dive,
Yeah.
and it kind of blew my mind.
What was that?
Well, apparently back in 1830, the average American drank something like the equivalent of over 60 bottles of whiskey every year.
Wow.
That's a lot of whiskey.
It really is a lot. I mean, that's like almost a bottle and a half every single week.
So were people just walking around tipsy all the time back then?
Well, I think it's important to remember that that average doesn't necessarily tell the whole story. A pretty significant portion of the population back then abstained from alcohol entirely
Okay.
for various reasons.
So that makes sense.
Yeah, like, women and people adhering to certain religious practices.
Right. So the actual consumption among those who did drink must have been even higher to reach that average.
Oh, absolutely. But even considering that,
Yeah.
that volume of alcohol just points to its role in everyday life back then.
That's interesting.
Yeah, think about it. Water wasn't always safe to drink back then.
Oh, especially in like cities and stuff.
Right, especially in those urban areas.
Right.
So, alcohol, particularly beer, was often seen as a safer alternative.
So it wasn't necessarily just a love of drinking.
Right.
It was also practical.
Exactly. It was out of necessity.
Okay, so that's really interesting to keep in mind as we kind of explore the rise of the temperance movement.
Yeah.
It wasn't just these moral crusaders trying to, like, impose their values on other people.
Exactly. Their concerns about alcohol abuse were really rooted in these social ills,
Right, like,
like poverty,
yeah, domestic violence,
workplace accidents.
all that.
Exactly. All fueled by alcohol abuse.
Yeah, and women were really at the forefront of that movement, weren't they?
Oh, absolutely. They often bore the brunt of those problems.
Of course.
And they had limited legal rights, no voting power, and were particularly vulnerable to the consequences of alcohol abuse.
Within their families, yeah.
Exactly. So for them, the temperance movement became a platform to address these issues,
Yeah.
to fight for their well-being and their community's well-being.
It's amazing how something that seems so, on the surface, like a simple issue like alcohol consumption,
Yeah.
can get so tied up with all of
Yeah.
these really complex social dynamics.
Yeah, it's a reminder that history is rarely black and white.
Right.
There are always these layers of motivations and complexities at play.
Now, we can't talk about pre-Prohibition America without talking about all the immigrant groups and their influence.
Oh, of course not.
Yeah.
You had the German immigrants who brought all of their brewing traditions over here to the Midwest. They established breweries in places like St. Louis and Milwaukee.
Interesting. Yeah.
They were really taking advantage of all those natural limestone caves.
Oh, wow, for refrigeration.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, think of the iconic American lager.
Yeah.
It's got roots, in those German brewing traditions.
And then you have the Irish who brought their whiskey distilling
Yeah.
expertise to cities like Boston and New York.
Exactly, shaping a whole other facet of American drinking culture.
And then later on, Italian immigrants bringing their winemaking
Exactly.
knowledge.
Yeah, further diversifying that American palate.
Yeah, so by the late 19th century, you've got this melting pot of drinking cultures,
Yeah.
all kind of contributing to what we think of as American drinking today.
It's pretty cool.
It's fascinating, though, how all these influences, which now are so, like, integral to American culture,
Right.
were initially viewed with suspicion.
That's right. For a
Yeah.
lot of people, particularly those from, older immigrant communities and those with like strong religious beliefs, these new drinking cultures were seen as disruptive and even threatening to the social order.
And that's where the temperance movement starts to gain some momentum,
Exactly.
tapping into those anxieties.
They really skillfully leveraged public concern about the perceived negative impacts of these new drinking cultures and framed it as moral decay fueled by immigrants.
So it wasn't just about the alcohol itself.
Right.
It was about these anxieties surrounding social change and the shifting cultural norms.
Exactly. And this is where the Anti-Saloon League enters the picture.
Right.
A group that truly understood the power of political maneuvering.
Yeah, they were led by Wayne Wheeler, weren't they?
Yes, they were.
And they were so good at mobilizing voters and lobbying
They
politicians.
just are pushing their agenda.
They were laser focused on that one goal, nationwide prohibition, and they were incredibly effective at it too.
They didn't care if you were a Democrat or Republican.
Nope, as long as you supported their cause.
That's some single-minded determination.
Yeah, it really is.
Uh,
But how did they take this state-by-state temperance movement and make it a constitutional amendment?
Well, this patchwork of state laws created a lot of inconsistencies and challenges.
Oh, man.
Yeah. So, imagine trying to enforce these dry laws in one state when the neighboring state is wide open.
People would just drive over the border and get a drink.
Exactly. That's what was happening. The Anti-Saloon League realized that for prohibition to truly work, it needed to be nationwide.
So they needed to amend the Constitution.
They did.
It's so wild to think about that amending the Constitution back then was so much more common
Yeah.
than it is today.
It was a different era in American politics.
Yeah, it really was.
Amending the Constitution was seen as a much more viable tool for enacting social change.
So in December of 1917, the 18th Amendment was proposed,
That's right.
prohibiting the manufacture, sale, or transportation of intoxicating liquors.
Exactly.
And just over a year later, in January 1919, it was ratified, ushering in this new era for America.
It did.
There's something interesting about that amendment, though.
Yeah,
Owning and drinking alcohol wasn't actually criminalized.
it's true.
It was the production and sale and transportation.
Yeah, the idea was to cut off the supply.
Right. Thinking that if people didn't have access, they would stop.
Precisely.
So they were really going after the suppliers more than the individuals.
They were, but as history would show, things didn't quite work out the way they planned.
That's where it gets really interesting, right? All those unintended consequences of prohibition.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, it was more dramatic in a lot of ways than the issue they were trying to solve.
It really was, and that's exactly what we'll explore further. The story Prohibition is a fascinating example of how even the most well-intentioned social engineering
Mhm.
can have very unexpected and often very dramatic outcomes.
That's right. Okay, so we've set the stage. America's got this complicated relationship with alcohol.
Yeah.
We've got the rise of the temperance movement and then ultimately the 18th Amendment. But what happened when Prohibition actually went into effect? Did everyone just stop drinking?
If only it were that simple. Human desire, especially when it comes to something like alcohol, which is so ingrained in our culture,
Yeah.
it's not that easily extinguished.
Well, then if there's a demand,
Yeah,
someone's going to find a way to supply it.
of course.
And that's where organized crime steps in.
Exactly. Figures like Al Capone.
Oh, yeah.
They saw this golden opportunity with this new black market.
Yeah.
Bootlegging became this wildly lucrative business.
Oh, yeah. It fueled all these criminal empires and led to some of the most violent times in American history.
you do.
Isn't that ironic?
Yeah. Yeah.
This policy, designed to reduce crime, actually created a whole new kind of criminal.
It's a classic case of unintended consequences,
Wow.
Prohibition really just handed over control of the alcohol industry to the very people it was trying to suppress.
It's crazy how that happens.
Yeah.
And it wasn't just the gangsters who were profiting from this.
Right.
Right, you had corrupt law enforcement officials turning a blind eye to all this illegal activity,
Oh, yeah. Absolutely. Or even participating in it.
further undermining,
Right.
the law.
Completely. In cities like Chicago and New York, speakeasies were just commonplace.
I bet.
They were operating pretty much openly
Wow.
with the tacit approval of, local authorities.
And all those stories about people going blind or
Yeah.
dying from drinking bathtub gin,
Oh, yeah.
those are all too real, weren't they?
Sadly, yes. With access to safely produced and regulated alcohol,
Yeah.
people turned to pretty desperate measures.
Right, they were making their own stuff in their bathtubs.
Yeah, with whatever ingredients they could find.
Wow.
And a lot of those homemade concoctions ended up containing some really dangerous substances.
And then there was a government's decision to actually poison industrial alcohol.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, thinking that would deter people from drinking.
I know. It's hard to imagine that logic now, isn't it?
Yeah.
They assumed that making it even more toxic would stop people from consuming it.
Yeah.
But of course, it backfired.
Didn't bootleggers just remove the warning labels
Oh, they did.
from this tainted alcohol and just kept selling it?
They did. And thousands of people died as a result.
Oh, my God.
It became very clear that the government's attempt to just control behavior through brute force, it went
Yeah.
horribly wrong.
It's a pretty grim picture you're painting of this era.
Yeah.
But in the midst of all this chaos, there was a cultural revolution happening.
There was.
Almost like Prohibition fueled the very thing it was trying to suppress.
Yeah.
This culture of, revelry and defiance.
It's pretty paradoxical, isn't it? I mean, the Roaring Twenties with its jazz music and speakeasies and flapper culture,
Yeah.
it was a direct response to all these restrictions of Prohibition.
Almost like the more they tried to clamp down, the more people pushed back.
Exactly.
Like-
Speakeasies weren't just places to go to get a drink. They became like social hubs, these incubators for new forms of music and fashion and social interaction.
And this was the Jazz Age.
Exactly.
It was a huge part of it.
Yeah, and women played such a pivotal role in this whole cultural shift,
Oh, absolutely.
They were entering the workforce in larger numbers, getting the right to vote, and really challenging those traditional norms of behavior.
And the flapper,
Yeah.
with her bobbed hair, short skirts, and unapologetic love of a cocktail
Exactly.
became like a symbol of all that.
She did.
So it really wasn't just about drinking.
No?
It was this pushing back against the older generation, the one that had really championed Prohibition.
It was a clash of values, a generational divide,
Yeah.
playing out against this backdrop of unprecedented social and economic change.
And speaking of economic change, the Great Depression really dealt the final blow to Prohibition, didn't it?
It did, as the nation kind of plunged into this economic turmoil.
Yeah.
The focus shifted, from moral crusades to just economic survival.
Right? The lost tax revenue from all those alcohol sales.
Yeah, it became very obvious.
And not to mention the hypocrisy of it all, outlawing alcohol, but then organized crime is making all the money from it.
It just became untenable. The government needed to replenish its coffers, and public support for Prohibition had really waned.
Yeah.
So in 1933, the 21st Amendment was ratified,
Wow.
repealing the 18th Amendment and ending that noble experiment, as they called it.
It's crazy how this amendment that was supposed to make society better and solve all these problems
Yeah.
ended up having the exact opposite
It
effect.
really highlights the complexities of human behavior, doesn't it?
It does. It reminds us that even these well-intentioned policies can have these unforeseen and often detrimental outcomes.
Absolutely. I mean, the legacy of Prohibition is just a tapestry woven from unintended consequences.
Yeah, like
The rise of organized crime, the public health crisis from all that unsafe alcohol,
Paul.
and that paradoxical cultural flourishing that just emerged in defiance of the law.
So what about the lasting impact on American culture and politics?
Yeah.
How do we see the echoes of this era today?
That's conversation worth having. The impact of Prohibition is far-reaching and continues to shape how we view the role of government, and individual freedoms and the unintended consequences of social engineering.
Prohibition's over, but it's like we're still feeling the effects of it,
I know it's true. The impact is pretty amazing, even something like cocktail culture today.
Oh, yeah. All those fancy cocktails.
Our fascination with the craft cocktails and mixology. I mean,
Oh.
it can be traced back to those days of bathtub gin.
Yeah, people had to get creative to cover up the taste of that awful homemade booze.
They did.
So maybe we can thank Prohibition for all those fancy speakeasy bars we have today. and those drinks with all bitters and syrups.
It's a reminder that, even in times of restriction, humans are going to find a way
Yeah.
to be creative. And, it's not just cocktail culture. I mean,
Right.
think about the impact on American politics. The Anti-Saloon League's success in pushing for a constitutional amendment,
Yeah.
it really shows the power of those single-issue political groups.
And we see that today, too.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, their tactics, mobilizing voters, lobbying politicians, using the media to shape public opinion.
All those things
Yeah.
are still in use today.
They are, and they're shaping our political landscape still, for better or worse.
Yeah. And even the debate surrounding Prohibition itself.
Oh, yeah.
The role of government in regulating personal behavior.
Yeah.
The potential for these unintended consequences.
Right.
I mean, those are discussions we're still having today
We are.
with like drug legalization, personal freedoms,
Yeah.
the limits of social engineering.
All of it.
Yeah, it's still so relevant.
So Prohibition's kind of a cautionary tale.
It is.
That even when you start out with good intentions,
Yeah,
things can go wrong,
they can.
sometimes with devastating consequences.
It really underscores the need to really think things through,
And anticipate those potential outcomes and just acknowledge that human behavior is complex.
You can't just outlaw something and expect it to disappear.
No.
It's like trying to hold back the tide. You might build a wall,
Yeah,
but the water's going to find a way around,
it will.
often making things worse.
Exactly.
So as we all enjoy our, legally obtained adult beverages today,
Yeah.
whether it's a craft beer, a glass of wine, or, one of those fancy cocktails.
Cheers to that.
Maybe we should all take a moment to think about this,
Yeah.
turbulent chapter in American history.
Yeah, and, maybe it's a reminder to approach these issues we're facing today with a little bit of skepticism.
Yeah.
A willingness to listen to other perspectives.
Absolutely.
And just a recognition that simple solutions to complex problems
Yeah.
don't always work out the way we hope.
They often make things worse.
Yeah, and those echoes of Prohibition remind us that history has lessons to teach if we're willing to listen.
That's a great point to end on. Well, this has been a fascinating deep dive into the world of Prohibition.
It has.
So until next time, cheers, everyone.